If you have a computer for any length of time at all, you know what happens to it. It slows down, like most of us, as age takes us. And here's what, so if you're tech savvy, you do this on your own, and if you're not tech savvy like me, then you take your computer in somewhere, and what they're going to do is they're going to run a system check on your computer to check the integrity of the system, because as things, update and all that again, over my head, but, these things happen. What you're going to get missing or corrupted files in your operating system that cause problems. They cause at the very worst, they're going to cause your operating system to actually crash from time to time. So the point I'm trying to make here is it doesn't matter how good the content on your computer is, like all these brilliant Word docs that you got and all these cute family pictures that are saved there, if the system itself is broken, not doing you a lick of good. And that's exactly the issue that we're discussing this morning. It's the integrity question. The integrity question, as in system integrity. Now, I know when we use the word integrity, especially in church, we're typically talking about one's character, and we will get there today because that's a big part of it. We talk about integrity with character because we're talking about whether what you preach and what you practice actually integrate or not. But we're starting a little bit further back. Do your thoughts themselves integrate? Do they form a cohesive whole, or do your thoughts kind of fight together? Do they contradict each other? This is the last question that we're looking at in this series, or many more that we could ask, but the last one we're doing at least in this series on the Bible questions. We started with the authority question. Where do you turn for answers when you've got questions? Okay, do you turn to a holy book like the Bible? Or do you find the answers within yourself, kind of trust your gut feeling? Do you go with something that culture teaches or a political platform or something like that? Then the next question was the assumption question. That authority, wherever you turn, what is it based on? Does it have a firm foundation, or is it squishy or cracked? The whole system is going to come on down. Third question we looked at last week, the proof question. Is it true? Like, what you hold, that's great, that's awesome, maybe it all fits together and everything, but if it's not true, it doesn't matter. So is it actually true? How would you know if it were true? How would you know if it were false? And now lastly, the question, the integrity question, does it work? Does your system actually work? And if not, that's an issue. So this morning we're running a system check. Okay, we're running a diagnostic check here because that's exactly what Jesus does for two despondent disciples that he meets on the road to Emmaus. So just a little recap before I reread the passage for you. They got these guys, they're coming from Jerusalem heading to Emmaus. This is just after the death and resurrection of Jesus. They don't know about the resurrection yet. They've heard some rumors that the tomb is empty, but they're all confused. Jesus sidles up alongside them as they're walking, but they don't recognize him. And so they got all these questions. They're heartbroken. They're hopeless at this point. And then in verse 25, let me read. Jesus said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. So 3 questions we're going to ask from this passage this morning. The first one, do you have a system? Do you have a system yourself? So here we are. We got 2 disciples whose faith system just crashed. Okay? Because of verse 21. They're talking to Jesus and they said, look, we had hoped that he, Jesus, was the one who was going to redeem Israel. So they had a vision for how this story was going to go, and it involved this Messiah liberating the nation of Israel from the Roman oppressors, taking them back to the halcyon glory days of David when Israel was this powerful world force. And as you know, military conquerors probably shouldn't die before they finish conquering. And Jesus just did that, so he's messed with them badly. So here Jesus, he's talking to them, and he runs a quick diagnostic test. You notice he starts with how foolish you are. Sounds like typical tech support, right? You should know better, and you should have fixed this on your own. But anyway, here's what he's asking. It's a question he's asking of us too. How are you reading the Bible? Are you just picking and choosing the parts you like? Or are you reading it as a comprehensive whole? 66 books, yes, but one unified story. The problem these guys have is that they've got missing files in their system. It's not that they're not there, like they've got the right books, they're just some that they don't really bother about. And so they're never accessing the information that is there. As a result, they see the redemption of Israel purely in physical or political terms. He's going to liberate them from Roman oppression. Which means that when they come to the Messiah, this liberator, they miss the fact that he's going to suffer, which is there. Like Isaiah 53 comes to mind. Surely he took up our pain, bore our suffering. That's there, but just didn't get to those files. That was in a different part of the hard drive, never accessed it. Now here's the thing, and it's kind of what we got in the video already. The Bible reads very differently from most holy books. Doesn't make it better or worse on its own right here, but whereas many holy books are a collection of loose sayings, the Quran is a good example of this. I mean, it is just a collection of sayings. Some of them contradict each other. That's not a problem in Islam. They've got something known as abrogation, where later revelation cancels out former revelation. So you do not need to read it as a unified whole. That's very different. What we just saw in the video, the Bible is one single epic story. So you've got many different threads weaving together a glorious gospel tapestry. You pull out even just one thread, like never liked the color ochre, so I'm going to take that one out, something like that. You lose key facets of the redemption. Or to put it another way, you take out some of the system files, system crashes, because that's what systems do. So you try to read texts in isolation, bad things happen. Okay? You're not going to have Christianity, you're going to have something else like it. You're going to struggle as you read. If you just open up to a random page, read a random passage, don't bother putting it into its context, there are going to be issues. Let me just give you a few examples. So let's say you turn to that passage in Genesis where God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. This is a horrifying passage. We know, we've read it, that the angel is going to stop Abraham from going through with the sacrifice. Great. That's nice. Still a pretty traumatic experience for a kid, I think. Probably a pretty traumatic experience for the father as well. How could a good, gracious, loving God ask Abraham to do something like this, or Isaac to be something like that? Well, that's if you read it in isolation. You put it in the whole context and you see something else. You see, look, God is preparing his people to understand his heart as a father, the sacrifice that he will make in sending his son. All of a sudden, the story makes a whole lot more sense. Doesn't change the trauma of that moment, but it certainly changes their experience of that trauma. Jesus says that Abraham saw and rejoiced to see my day, that he saw what was coming. He understood, and there was joy, not trauma, in his life. Or take another one, much more likely the way for us to read it in our culture today is you take one of those feel-good passages like Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. You slap it on a coffee mug because that one sounds good, because you know it means God's going to make your life turn out good. And you cling. The problem is you're ripping that text out of its context. Like Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet. Okay, he's not known as the feel-good self-help prophet by any means. So you stick this back into context, and it's a very different message. He's speaking to a nation that because of their rebellion against God, their persistence in sin is being exiled from the promised land. The glory of God's going to actually leave the temple because of their sin. So they're getting sent to Babylon. And God says, look, in 70 years, I'm going to bring you back. That's the plan. That's the future that he has. And 500 years after that, a baby's going to be born in a stable, and he's going to die. Okay, there's your hope. There's your future. 70 years means all of you who are here in this prophecy, you're all going to be dead. Has nothing to do with you, okay? Just know that a later generation is going to experience that hope and that future, and it's going to come through a crucified Messiah. It's a little different thing, right? Okay, you want to put that on a coffee mug, that's fine. Here's where you bring that one out. It's like if you messed up your life badly and you're going to jail because you got involved in fraud at your company, and then God says, here, okay, in those 9 years in prison, just know that I have a plan for you. I'm going to use the punishment that you deserve for your sin to do something good in your life. Now we got a text in context. Not as many of us want that coffee mug, though, I don't think. I could say, if you let me rip verses out of context, I could justify absolutely any system on the planet. You want me to find socialism in here? I can find it. You want me to find cannibalism in here? I can find it. I can find anything you want if you let me take verses out of context. Do you read the Bible as a whole, or do you pick and choose the passages you like? Because that's what every heretic on the planet does. You want a prosperity gospel, a gospel that promises you health and wealth, like Joyce Meyer, Benny Hinn, Creflo Dollar teach? Great, you can find it here. Just rip them out of context. You want a self-help gospel, like Joel Osteen and Rob Bell teach? That's fine. You can find it here. Just rip them out of context. You want a social justice gospel, like Tony Campolo and Brian McLaren teach? It's fine. You can find it here. You just got to rip them out of context. How do you read the Bible? Here's how Jesus says we do it. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Beginning, with Genesis, this is Moses, the green book's over here, all the way to the end, he explains how all of Scripture points to him, centers on Jesus. So before we even dig in a little bit, that's the first question again. Do you have a system? Do you have a system? If it's not Christianity, what is it? And if you claim that it's Christianity, is your Christianity a system, or is it just a collection of loose thoughts? Take a little bit from here, a little bit from here, whatever it is that you like, what sounds good to you at the time, you're going to try and form that into. That's not an operating system. All right, that's something else. That's just a couple of files that you smush together. You pick and choose the ideas that appeal to us. It's the old soda fountain approach. Some of you did this when you were a kid, right? You go up to the soda fountain at Chuck E. Cheese's or something, and you're like, disgusting, all right? But it's called a kamikaze. We all did it. We all liked it. All right, fine. Maybe you like that approach when it comes to soda. That does not work when it comes to a worldview. All right? And it doesn't matter what it is, different religious ideas or different secular ideas, it does not do these ideas really work together. There's a great danger with a loose collection of sayings or a loose collection of thoughts, and that they might not work together. In fact, you can see this. You look at Proverbs, which are meant to be collections of sayings, whether Proverbs like the book of the Bible, Proverbs, or even just, grab some secular Proverbs. They're very limited in scope. We've talked about this before. There's Proverbs 26, do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will become a fool like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, otherwise he'll become wise in his own eyes. Back-to-back verses contradict each other, don't go together. Well, we understand why. Because with Proverbs, that's okay. You could almost translate the two of them together as answer a fool according to the dictates of wisdom. What does wisdom require here? So it makes sense with Proverbs, but it does not work with metaphysics. Does not work with the big ideas that shape how we view the world. Let me just give you an example. This one this came home to me. I was a very young believer at the time. Was in a college class. I was an English major. So it was an English class doubled as a women's studies class. So I was in unique company. I was the only male in the room. Certainly the only one who had any sort of conservative religious ideas in his head or anything like that. So conversation was often interesting. I learned to keep quiet, which I'm not good at. This was a growing experience for me. Well, so one particular class period, we spent the first half of class laughing at those Victorian prudes because they would censor the works of D.H. Lawrence, just a bit too racy for their tastes and sensibilities, and so they banned his books. I kid you not, the very next conversation we had was about why we should ban the books of Shakespeare because of their misogyny and anti-Semitism. There's a conflict there. Okay, I don't care where you stand on Shakespeare or banning books, okay? There's a conflict because you're saying it's mock-worthy to have a culture ban books because they don't line up with the culture of the day or something like that, and then in the next breath say we need to ban these books because they don't line up with the culture of the day. Which one is it? Do you see? Do they come together or not? And that's the next question we got to ask. It's right where we're headed. So do you have a system? I hope so. I hope so, but maybe not. The second question, though, is does your system have integrity? Can it cohere? They go together or not. The key question that Jesus asks his disciples in this passage is, verse 26, did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? Did not the Messiah have to suffer first and then enter glory? The question he's asking here, does your system integrate all the data or not? And here, in this context at least, he's saying if you can't explain the suffering of the Messiah, you haven't read the Bible carefully. And so Jesus walks them through this. He takes two seemingly divergent streams in Scripture and shows how they cohere. Those two divergent streams are God's love and God's holiness. He does it with glory and suffering as well to show how those two belong together. But we covered that at length in 1 Peter. Last series we did. So if you got questions about that, I would encourage you to just give them a listen. So let's dig in here a little bit, though, these divergent streams. In our touchy-feely culture, we are very comfortable with a God of love. In fact, I would argue that most anyone in our culture today would say, if God exists, then he would have to be a God of love. Now, I want you to know how radical that is, by the way. That assumption is itself the product of Christianity. As you go to cultures that do not have Christianity in their history, you're not going to find that. You go to other cultures today and do evangelism, they're going to have an issue with the God of love. They got no problem with the God of holiness and wrath. That makes sense to them. But so that's where we are, at least. If God exists, we know he must be a loving God. But let's tease it out a bit. Can you truly love without caring about your beloved's choices? I think anyone who has been a parent knows these go hand in hand. A kid comes home from school and it's clear that they have given up on their education. They're just done with it. They're flunking out and all that stuff. You see the trajectory of their life, and what do? You don't say, it's okay, honey, do whatever you want. You say, it's not going down this way, all right? Not on my watch. I love you too much. Parents say this, right? I love you too much to let you ruin your life. You see it even more clearly when it comes to addiction, chemical or otherwise. I mean, this is what an intervention is, isn't it? It's a group of people who say, we love you too much to let you destroy yourself any longer. Now, the Bible is very clear that every one of us makes poor choices. We are selfish creatures, and our selfishness leads us to choose poorly, not only for ourselves, but also for those around us. We learned last week in the Catechism what sin is. It's living without reference to God, living as though the most important being in the universe doesn't exist. And that means that we then look for security and hope and joy and all of those sorts of things in idols. Our Catechism question this week. Now, what does God do when he sees us on a path to self-destruction? His love, just like a parent's, because he is the perfect parent, leads him to a righteous, loving anger. If we have a truly loving God, we will have to believe in a God of wrath against our sin, against our foolish desire for autonomy, our rejection of the only one who can bring us the joy and peace that we seek. It will be God's loving wrath against our own self-destruction, the misery that results from sin. Which means for Messiah to redeem us truly, he's not going to redeem us from Roman oppression. He's going to redeem us from ourselves. And that means he has to die first. He has to suffer first. That wrath of God against our own self-destructive bent falls on him instead of us so that we can receive his love. That's the whole purpose of the cross. So in this case, looking at the whole story together, the system's fine. The problem was not that there are missing files in the system. The problem was just that these two guys, at least, they weren't looking at all the files in the system. That's verse 27. That's why Jesus says, let's start with Moses. Let's go through the prophets. Let's access all the information, and you're going to see what this leads to. Now, that's not the case with every system. Some systems simply lack integrity. There's no way around it. They cannot function. They got contradictions at the core. Take some of our most sacred secular cows in our culture today. Issues of love and personal freedom and sexual identity, and they're all wrapped up together. The highest good in our culture is personal freedom, autonomy. I'd be willing to argue that at length. You got issues, come and talk. But we also value selfless love and authentic community. You read the stories that go viral or something like that, and they tend to be people who sacrifice on behalf of others. Now, do these two work together? Can they function in a single system? Do they integrate? I don't think so. Let me explain why. So there's a difference between consumer and covenantal relationships. I think we understand that. Effectively, the difference is between what I give and what I get. So in a consumer relationship, you stay only so long as the terms are good. We have that. We know that because we're all consumers. So shop at Aldi or something like that. That's where I get my veggies and whatnot. If the veggies are on sale somewhere else and they're cheaper, I go there. I do not feel any loyalty to Aldi. Okay, that's a consumer relationship. I'm in it for what I can get. They're in it for what they can get, by the way, which is my money. Okay, that's a consumer relationship. Now, historically, family relationships, like marriage, are based on covenant instead. Covenant. Meaning, it's not about what I get. If the terms change, I'm committed still. And historically, again, at least, it was good to view physical intimacy as reserved for those covenantal relationships. Okay, we're past that now at this point. Right? Since the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s, we're past that now. Because at this point, we want freedom to pursue whatever we think will bring us the most happiness. We want freedom to express ourselves sexually, which means we get to have physical union apart from covenant. Deeply embedded in our culture. Here's what this looks like then. All right, so this is an actual quote from someone I happened to see on social media. Change details so as not to give away identity or anything like that. But here's an actual quote. This is where it leads. Person says, "It has been great to date a friend who respects my autonomy." Key word, highest good in our culture, personal freedom, autonomy. "It has been great to date a friend who respects my autonomy, and that I'm choosing to date this person, not feeling obligated by the confines of commitment." Now, with all compassion and understanding for how this person got to that place, this statement represents the death of love. Love is fundamentally impossible in a statement like that. Basically, what has just been said is I choose to stay with you on my terms. And if it stops being good for me, I'm out. I'm done. There's no commitment there. That is the opposite of love. Because the love at its core wills the good of the beloved. That's what love is. So what we have here is not love, but the unpolluted love of self. It is an exploitation. That's what that relationship is. It doesn't matter how kindly you're doing it, you're using that person to bring you the happiness that you like, which means personal freedom, God number one, and concern for others, God number two, are often in conflict. They don't cohere. You cannot move from self-gratification to self-sacrifice along these lines. The system fails. Should come as no surprise to us, by the way. The term sexual revolution, it comes from a book written by Wilhelm Reich, psychologist in the early 20th century, who taught all of the ideas that have now permeated our culture. And so he taught that, your sexual freedom is the highest good, that it should be the basis of your identity and all that. And guess what happened in his life? He left a whole lot of broken people behind. Wife that he left, mistress whose heart he broke. In fact, one of his mistresses came to him sobbing, begging him not to force her to have an abortion that resulted from their sexual union, and he wouldn't give in. He wasn't going to allow an accidental pregnancy or the desires of somebody he claimed to love get in the way of his personal happiness. That's where that system leads. Didn't have many friends either, by the way, because he kept trying to sleep with their wives. Go figure. All right, let's similar vein here when you look at the prevalence of pornography in our culture today. Which again, a part of the same culture. People should have the right to view whatever they want. Don't tell me what I can and cannot look at. But it is undeniable, and again, you got questions about this, come talk to me, I'll point you in the direction of the research. It is undeniable that the pornification of our culture leads to human trafficking and violence against women. Which means you cannot be pro-porn, pro-sexual freedom, and pro-social justice at the same time. They do not cohere. The system fails. As long as we're talking social justice, let's go with that one. We've discussed this one before. You cannot hold Darwinism, naturalism, the idea that humanity is just an accidental collocation of molecules, time plus matter plus chance. You cannot hold that idea and human rights simultaneously. They do not work together because the whole Darwinian concept inherently denies the idea of human equality or dignity. Survival of the fittest means some of us are fitter than others. Some of us deserve to live and some of us do not. Whereas, of course, human rights would tend to argue exactly the opposite. This is why, I mentioned this a few weeks back, Dr. King, when he was talking about racial justice, did not argue from a secular Darwinist conception of the world. He argued based on Scripture. And the fact that we are all, black and white, male and female, on down the line, created in the image of God. Hey, as long as we're talking Dr. King, it was he who said a little bit famously that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. It's a great quote. I happen to think it's true. It's not a statement that all people can make. It is a uniquely Christian statement. Because again, let's just take on Darwinian or naturalistic terms, history is necessarily purposeless. Quoted Jerry Coyne a couple weeks back in Naturalist, and he said exactly that. We know that history doesn't have a purpose, which means it's not bending towards anything. It's just going not even in a direction, just squiggly line kind of thing. That's how history's going. Plus, the very notion of justice, the idea that it'd be bending towards justice, is absurd on Darwinian terms. There can be no moral standard within Darwinism, as Darwinists acknowledge. There's no universal conception of justice. Again, it's just what will lead to the survival of our species, and specifically my survival. I'm not as concerned about the rest of my species. Let me give you one more example. Because this one was instructive because this woman recognized that her system didn't work, and I want you to see what happens. This is Carolyn Fleur-Laban, who is a cultural anthropologist. She wrote an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education called Cultural Relativism and Universal Human Rights. Those, by the way, are the two pieces of the system that are about to come into conflict: cultural relativism and universal human rights. So cultural relativism, the idea that all moral beliefs are culturally created and culturally bound. There's no true for everyone everywhere. It's just true for us here. And the only reason we think it's true for us here is because we were raised in that culture. So there's no way to judge objectively between different cultures. They, all have their right to think what they want. So that's core belief of this woman, but then she was also appalled by the oppression of women in the cultures that she studied as an anthropologist. And so she writes this, I'm taking snippets from the article. What authority do we Westerners have to impose our own concept of universal rights on the rest of humanity? That's the cultural relativism. We can't say we're right and you're wrong because there's no objective standard of right and wrong. But then she goes on to say this. I believe that we should not let the concept of moral relativism stop us from examining ways to protect the lives and dignity of people in every culture. When there is a choice between defending human rights and defending cultural relativism, anthropologists should choose to protect and promote human rights. We cannot just be bystanders. I don't disagree with her, by the way. We should be promoting human rights. We should not just be bystanders. But look at what she just said. It's wrong for me to impose my beliefs on another culture. It's also wrong to degrade or dehumanize women. And she recognizes the key question here: how can I impose my values if they're not universal? And then she refuses to answer. She gives no answer to the question. She knows her view of universal human rights or the equality of the sexes is culturally bound. Comes from 18th century Western world, or truthfully, it comes from the Bible, but she still wants to impose it on others. Women are being oppressed, and she feels like she needs to stop it. So she knows that her values are better, period. Do you see? Like, that's the heart of the integrity question right there. Does your system, does your worldview cohere or not? Does it work? And if not, it might be time for a new operating system. Keep coming up to the blue screen of death otherwise. Or your other option is to live with cognitive dissonance, which is what Fleur-Lebon has chosen here. To keep believing something that you know is wrong. It's a choice. It's a dishonest choice. So let's look at the last question then, which kind of draws that out some. Do you have a system? Does your system have integrity? Do you live your system with integrity? This, by the way, is where the computer analogy breaks down badly. That's okay. It's an analogy. A personal response is required if different systems are true or false. You see it in verse 32 here. So let me just recap the rest of the story. So Jesus walks through whole Bible with them, shows how it all points to him, and they're walking along. It's like coming up on dinner time, and Jesus is making like he's going to keep walking, and they say, no, share a meal with us. And so he says, okay, fine. He breaks the bread, which kind of reminds us of the Lord's Supper, like as a key moment, and at that moment, then their eyes are open, and they recognize Jesus for who he is, and at that point, he vanishes. He's in a glorified state. He's all cool and extra-dimensional at this point, so comes in and out of our perception. So he vanishes, and they say this, verse 32, they asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? Their hearts burned within them. They recognized the truth embodied in a person, Jesus. And presumably, from that moment on, they were able to live their system with integrity. We do not get to hear any more about these two disciples, Cleopas and the other guy, but we see it in the lives of the other disciples whose lives we do get to track with. That whole suffering and glory thing, they got that. Because every one of Christ's disciples went through immense suffering on the road to glory, just as their Messiah had done. But there's the question for us as well. Can you live your system with integrity? And even more importantly, do you live your system with integrity? And we saw already this is not a slam dunk of a question. There are people who cannot live a system with integrity because the system lacks integrity. That was Fleur-Lebon, what we talked about. Now, if you can't live your system with integrity, most likely it's because the system doesn't have integrity, and I would encourage you to examine it. Like, it's time to go back. The whole point of this series, take a harder look at what you think than we sometimes do. If you can't put it into practice, if you know the implications of your system and you're unwilling to actually do it, then maybe it's time to rethink. Let me give you an example. So Peter Singer is a famous utilitarian ethicist. Utilitarianism is basically the idea that the ends justify the means. So we make ethical decisions not based on what is right or wrong, but on whether or not good or bad results from it. And it's a dangerous system. You get people like the Nazis, big fans of it, right? It makes me a little bit concerned. Now, most of Peter Singer's arguments point to the idea that it is okay to kill defective humans. And he's written at length about this. You can read it. So not only pro-abortion, for example, killing a child in the womb, but pro-infanticide as well, because a child outside the womb, when it's still young, can't think and reason and do the things that humans are supposed to do. So you would still be within your rights to kill that child. Of course, that means the mentally handicapped can be killed. The elderly, especially as they're heading into any sort of degenerative state, could be killed because the medical costs of keeping them alive simply aren't worth it. You track with world news, by the way, Alfie Evans, that whole story that's going on in London, it just ended yesterday with his death. That's utilitarian ethics, okay? That was what was driving this London hospital at this time. So here's what happened in Singer's life, though. So he's made all these. His system is very consistent, by the way. I appreciate that about men like Singer, men and women like Singer, is that he recognized the implications of his system. And so he went, look, if this is true and if there is no God, then it's okay to kill defective people. And that's absolutely right. So he's got a consistent system. But then here's what happened. His mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, which means he should let her die, help her along, something like that. Not what he did. He and his siblings, they hired around-the-clock care for her to help her in her state. People caught wind of this and they said, hey, Pete, what's going on, man? And he said, and he's absolutely right, it's different when it's your mother. Now, to his credit, he went on to say, it's forced me to rethink some of my system. And that's exactly the point I'm trying to make, okay? Is your system going to lead you to a place where you are forced to rethink it because you cannot live your system with integrity? You see this all over the place. That's an extreme example. We could look at much more common examples as well. I mean, how many times in our culture have we heard, you Christians, you're so judgmental. You're always telling people what to think. You shouldn't do that. Pointed out before is telling people how to think, so a little bit of hypocrisy built in. But that to the side, it doesn't work for very long, because at some point you come up against something that you recognize as evil and you want to say you shouldn't do that. Racism is wrong. People deserve equality. Me Too movement, all of these different pieces here, and you're going, so you're telling us how to live, and you're right to do it, but that means you should rethink your system. There is another option. It's what the disciples learn. It's what's taught throughout this whole book. In fact, maybe most famously in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Wonderful passage. It sums up our whole series in so many ways. Up on the screen for you. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. That's all our questions right there, other than maybe the proof question. I mean, you see the authority question in there? What are you trusting in? Trust in the Lord with all your heart. There's the assumption question that's built in. You don't want to lean on your own understanding, because that structure, that's going to collapse if you don't examine the foundation, see if there's truth at the base of it all. And we've talked about this before. If we don't like this, the submit in all your ways, that's like a no-no in our culture. You don't tell me to submit in all my ways. But why is that? It's because we've got this ingrained sense of we have the right to question everything. Except, of course, we never question our right to question everything. That whole idea, so assumption question is just built into this. But more than anything else, it's the integrity question. The Bible can guide you in all your ways. Not because you can rip verses out of context or anything like that, but if you read it, if you immerse yourself in the whole story from Genesis to Revelation, this Christ-centered story, the story of God's redemption of humanity from themselves, you'll begin to understand this God who made us for him, the God who saves us despite our rebellion against him, and that will change your view of everything. Absolutely everything. Turn to the Bible. Build your system on the sure foundation, the system that works, because it's not a system worked out in an abstraction, but in a person, Jesus, the one to whom the whole Bible points, the one to whom the law and prophets point, the one to whom all of history points. And here's the thing, this little episode that we have today, that can still happen. Jesus is not with us in the flesh anymore, but by his Spirit, he is still here. He still speaks, and he can still make your heart burn within you if you only listen to him. Let us pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you that you are in our midst still, that you take the time to speak to us through your word, that we might understand. My prayer is from Proverbs 3, that you would help us not to lean on our own understanding any longer. And if that means having the structure collapse so that we fall down and get some bruises to see that we cannot lean on our own understanding, then so be it, Lord. We would welcome that, because we want to know the truth. And once we know the truth, not in abstraction, but in the person, Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, once we know, we want to trust him. We want to submit to him in all our ways, to acknowledge him for who he is, Creator, Lord, Sovereign King, gracious Redeemer, and to live in light of that truth with integrity and with worship. We ask this in his name. Amen.